Hello, and welcome to the first lecture of Principles of Ecology, a course being taught via online YouTube lectures, as well as one sort of synchronous class via Zoom at Louisiana State University. This is the first lecture of the series. There'll be a total of about 8 lectures from me. This course is being co-taught by myself, Tad Dallas, and Daijing Li, both ecologists. By way of introduction, I'm, I guess, defining myself as more of like a community and disease ecologist at the moment. We'll get into sort of what that means when we go into this like introductory lecture on ecology. My background, I got my PhD at University of Georgia in the Odom School of Ecology. I then did 2 postdocs, one with Alan Hastings at the University of California, in Davis, and then the second with Atso Ovaskainen in Helsinki, the University of Helsinki in Finland. Before getting this position, which I've only been in for about a little over a year. Taught this course once before. This is the first time virtually, so it should be fun, and it does present some inherent challenges. There'll be a separate lecture and interaction with students where I'll get sort of your feedback on what you see as potential sticking points and what you really want to get out of this class. But for now, I'm just going to sort of trudge on with like the sort of introductory materials about what is ecology, and then we can have more give and take later. There will be, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. So there will be readings associated with the class. And so here I list 2 readings. The first one is how to read a scientific article. There's no textbook for this course, but there are recommended readings that I provide links to, or that I provide on the GitHub repository for course notes that is linked most likely in the comments, almost guaranteed in the comments of this video. If not, then it's on the channel description. But the readings will sometimes be book chapters, but they will also could be scientific articles. So I'd like to, this is an upper level course, and I'd like to touch on aspects of how to read scientific articles. I think it's a really useful skill, even if students aren't going into an inherently scientific field. I think being able to read with that level of like sort of criticality, if that's the word, is very good. And then the second paper is What Does Ecology Have to Do with Me? This is a small publication from the Ecological Society of America, which is sort of our biggest society for ecology. The meetings are fantastic. I sadly, this one year is virtual, but maybe next year. All right, and this is one of the only sort of lectures that I'll have an actual like sort of presentation for. The others I use like sort of Inkscape and try to draw things to really communicate points instead of just putting sort of bullets on a slide. And I think that communicates concepts better, but feel free to like sort of weigh in on that. All right. And so this is normally when I'd sort of do like a think, pair, share, or like some sort of group activity, breakout rooms, sort of defining the discipline of ecology, like sort of what made you sign up and take ecology as a student, what made you search for this YouTube video, defining and then saying like, what is ecology? And so I define it sort of, these are the lecture notes that I'll be using to go through, there we go. Topics. I've organized them roughly by week, but some topics will take longer, some topics will take shorter than a week. So yeah, I think the general structure is how I'm going to present it is just sort of going through the notes with the help of sort of a sketchpad type tool and just explaining things. Okay, so ecology as defined fairly recently. I feel like we didn't get a good handle on it until maybe like the mid 80s. I feel like there was a lot of talk about it. But I would sort of define it. I think the current accepted definition is it's the study of species interactions. This is species interactions with other species. This is species interactions among themselves. So intra-specific interactions versus inter-specific interactions, where intra is between members of the same species, as we'll sort of go into in next week when we talk about single species population growth and population dynamics. So, and then interspecies, so there's things like competition, parasitism, predation, these processes that occur via species interactions of two different species. And it's also not just species interactions, but also the interactions between the species and the environment. And so that's a two-way street, right? So I'm living in Louisiana. The temperature affects me. I'm wearing like 3 layers because it's cold outside. I'm just kidding. It's like 60 degrees. It's a little bit less than that, but still. So the climate is affecting me. That's a climate toward me interaction. But I can also affect the climate. It's a little bit, that's where the analogy falls apart for humans. But we can imagine, I mean, it doesn't really though. We affect the land use change and we affect it in a much more profound way. But think of a pine tree growing in a forest. It drops its needles. Its needles actually can acidify the soil. It's changing its environment around it, meaning the species can also influence the environment. When a beaver takes a log down and dams a stream, it's changing its environment. I'm seeing if I've missed anything. Okay. The key though, the key sort of bit of ecology is the study of species interactions. And so I spend a little bit of time here in this slide digging into what those interactions are. Okay. For some reason, I thought I also did it on that slide, on the lecture notes, but in a different place. And I was like, oh no, this is going to be chaotic. I did not. So species interactions, as I sort of laid out, could be as simple as competition, either intra-specifically, meaning between one species, or inter-specifically, two different species. And this could happen sort of competition, predator-prey, and these, anything below competition are inherently inter-specific. So unless you consider cannibalism predator-prey interaction, because some species do have like cannibalistic, like flower beetles or tons of other things. So predator-prey interaction would mean some predator eating some prey. Maybe you can generalize this also to consumer resource. And so herbivory is not typically considered a predator-prey interaction, but it is a consumer resource interaction. And then there's other sort of different species interactions that take on a clearly different affect, a clearly different outcome to the interacting partners, right? So plant pollinator interactions are typically viewed as mutualistic interactions. And so it's something that I do want to go over is the different flavors of species interactions. So these are examples of species interactions, but species interactions, I'm gonna hop over to Inkscape, come in different sort of overall flavors. And that we can rank them or like quantify them by just calling them symbioses, which means just living together is sort of the root of that. And so there's a bunch of different forms of symbioses. And so let's just, hopefully I spelled that right. Where are we at? That would be embarrassing if I spelled parasitism wrong, since I do study disease and parasite host parasite interactions and mutualism. So the plant pollinator interaction that we just sort of mentioned would be an example of a mutualism. This occurs because both partners benefit. The plant becomes pollinated and the pollinator typically gets some sort of reward in terms of nectar or something like that. Host-parasite interactions, the host inherently has a deficit, something negative, a negative impact happen to it, and the parasite benefits because it's consuming something. So a tick will actually actively consume the host's blood, which is an energetic cost to the host. And so the parasitic interaction is one in which the parasite benefits and the host suffers. And then there's two others, commensalism and amensalism. And you don't hear like that much about these. And I'm not sure why. I guess these are cooler. And this is really like not just parasitism, but if you want to think about like consumer resource interactions, like a lot of them would fall under this sort of positive negative scheme. So maybe it's not the best sort of schema to have. Commensalisms occur when one organism receives a benefit and the other just doesn't, it receives a null sort of thing. It doesn't get hurt. There's no like population level demographic consequences. And then amensalism is one species has a negative interaction on the other and it receives no net benefit. So a good example of an amensalism would be, like I mentioned before, if you can imagine a pine tree or a conifer shedding its needles and acidifying the soil, that can have a negative impact on the growth of plants in the understory through like sort of it's called allelopathy. And yet it would actually potentially not actually benefit from that acidification of the soil. All right. I'm gonna switch back over to the notes. I just wanted to go into sort of how we tend to lump things in these four terms, but they're not necessarily hard and fast, because you can imagine this parasitism maybe shouldn't be parasitism, but should be like consumer resource interaction or predation almost. But it doesn't even necessarily have to be a sort of consumptive act, right? You don't have to have the parasite or predator eating part of the host to have a negative effect on it, because competition inherently has a negative effect on a species. So it's hard to even mash competition into this as well. But it is still a useful paradigm in sort of trying to think of all the different flavors of ways species or populations can interact and live together. Okay. Yeah, I talked a little bit about species interactions with the environment. And here I'm defining a term, abiotic. Abiotic means non-living. And so biotic variables are those like the population density of a competitor. That's a biotic variable. It is living. And abiotic would be like, what's the temperature outside? It is a non-living thing. All right. And so I think we've done a decent job at sort of defining ecology and sketching out some terms around ecology that you may or may not be familiar with. The next, I think it's sort of useful to define ecology a little bit by what it is not before going into how we study ecology. Excuse me. How we study ecology and the different levels of ecological or biological organization at which we study it. All right, so what's not ecology? And these are like a broad brush, and people might even sort of disagree with how I've sketched these out. But environmentalism, I think a lot of students my first semester came in thinking, this is a class that's going to tell me how to recycle. And that's not what this class is going to be. It's going to be way more equations than pandas and stuff like that. So I'm going to get that right out there in the open. So if you have problems with not thinking about species as species, but maybe in more general theory terms, you're not going to like this course, or you may not like this course. I hope you still like the course, but and I'm not going to tell you how to recycle. Biomedicine and epidemiology sort of fall into humans and or disease thereof, and that's not ecology. I, as one who studies disease ecology and has studied epidemics in human populations, I recognize that there is some like overlap, especially with epidemiological theory and the application of it to ecology. But epidemiology is quite distinct in that it's the study of human disease with focus on mitigation and less on understanding the sort of complexity of the factors that contribute to the spread of disease in non-human populations. So instead of epidemic, those would be epizootics. And then biomedicine would be trying to sort of apply concepts of biology or ecology to create or uncover medical treatments for humans, which is different. We won't talk about that at all. We sometimes, in later lectures, we'll kind of like get close to epidemiology in terms of the models, but we will always discuss it, or typically we tend to discuss it in a very like sort of ecological way, if that makes sense. And then lastly, or second to lastly, is natural history. Natural history is how sort of ecology started, and so it feels mean to like throw it under the bus, but I'm going to say that natural history is not ecology. Natural history is sort of the descriptive study of natural systems, and so you go out and say, here are the qualities of this plant. Here are the, I don't even know, it's not even distribution necessarily. The distribution can be tied into natural history, but it's not testing anything, if that makes sense. It is, sometimes natural history is pejoratively referred to as stamp collecting. It's a description of the natural world, which is really useful, but it is not, it's not ecology. It's not the study of species interactions in any sort of formularized way. And then lastly, evolution, which is very, very closely related to ecology. There's like a whole sort of subfield of like eco-evolutionary feedbacks. But I would still argue that evolution is slightly different. You'll see a lot of departments being defined as ecology and evolutionary biology. And it's like, they recognize that there's a difference. So evolution is basically there's changes in allele frequencies and genetic structure as a function of time. And that can interact with ecological processes, right? So species interactions can fuel evolution. Evolution can fuel species interactions. We may talk about this later in the semester, we may not. But evolution just sort of recognize that it is inherently different from a lot of the stuff that we'll go over and sort of define under the purview of ecology. They also operate under sort of different time scales. Ecology is typically examined on shorter time scales, evolutionary time scales, which are many generations. All right. So now we can talk about the different levels of biological organization. And this graphic does a pretty good job. And so there are 5 levels. This is actually missing one level. I include biome as well. So I'll talk you through it and then I'll sort of add in biome into it. So the individual is a sort of obvious level of biological organization, and that is the single individual. And so a lot of studies occur, especially in sort of behavioral ecology at the level of the individual. Some dispersal studies as well. So things like, you want to look at like individual variation in some quality. So individual variation in fecundity, which is like the number of offspring per individual. Individual variation in, an example, a single trout in Lake Superior. Yeah, and so I think I give an example of individual variation in bird song, sort of the frequency and ticks of a bird song. Individual variation in dog next door barking, if you can hear that. And then it goes up to a population. A population is defined as a collection of individuals living in a specific geographic place. And so they are assumed to interact. There's a geographic bound that we're placing on them as a population. And so that's important. These two sort of qualities in defining a population. But we're still at a single species, right? So a population is composed of individuals of a single species that occupy a geographically distinct area. And then we can scale up from that sort of single species view to consider interspecific interactions and consider the community, where we define the community as the set of interacting species that occupy a given geographic area. This gets a little muddied when we start thinking about communities of potentially non-interacting things, or species that are in different trophic levels. Trophic level being like what you eat. And so you can imagine if we want to say this is a community, we wouldn't say this is here's a bunch of grass species, and then here's a bunch of herbivores, and then here's some sort of tertiary like consumer. That's not really a community. That's an entire food web. So typically community would be defined as that same sort of trophic level of species that interact in a similar way to one another, right? And so when you start having directional feeding relationships, you start getting into territory where that's not really a community in some people's definition of community. And so here the example that I give of a community are fish communities, which there could be piscivorous fish, which means fish that eat other fish. And that's a little bit of a muddy example, but typically you want something that's like a similar group of organisms occupying some discrete geographic area, and they interact through like competition and other processes. From that, we can scale up and actually consider the environment, right? And so communities don't really consider the context in which these species are interacting, but an ecosystem would. And so when we think like the fish communities in Lake Superior, the ecosystem would now become Lake Superior. Like it's the entire community and the physical attributes of the system that it occupies. This starts to blur a lot of lines because it's less about just species interactions with one another, right? So a community, you don't really consider the context of the environment as much as an ecosystem, where all of a sudden you care about like nitrogen cycling and lake respiration and all of these things that are very abstracted from the study of species interactions, right? There's lake respiration, it's like a consequence of species interactions, less so like the direct species interactions. But still, like I came from a school of ecosystem ecology. The Odom School of Ecology is like traditionally a very ecosystem focused school. So yeah, I like it. They're cool. Ecosystems are neat. But much more focused on the physical environment. And then I jump here to Biosphere, which is just the planet, all the interacting things, using interaction here very loosely. And this is where biome would go. And I think I excluded biome in the slides, and maybe they excluded biome here because it is a little bit of a slippery concept. Typically ecosystem would be like a specific small thing. Here is a river. Here is the ecosystem of this river or lake or this forest ecosystem. It would have to be more specific than that. Biome would be like all forests. It's like a type of habitat in which, yeah, there's a particular climate. And so it gets it's like an intermediate between an ecosystem, which would be defined more as like a specific place, like Lake Superior, this ecosystem, but it's not the whole world. And so I almost want to exclude biome because there's a bunch of different people trying to like define what biome would be via different like covariates. Like, do you define biome based on the species that are present? Do you define biome based on just sheerly climatic factors? I don't know the answer to either of those questions. I think typically it's defined more by climate, but maybe it shouldn't be. So like tropical rainforest would be maybe a good example of a biome. Tundra, it's a biome, it's not an ecosystem. All right. And if a college is watching this and disagree with me, toss it in the comments. That could be fun. All right. Oh, and I give examples of how we do different studies at at these different levels of biological organization. And I also go into like, it's not like a common theme. I dwell much more on the theory of things than on our role as humans in impacting ecological processes. But I do provide some instances here in which humans alter different scales of biological organization. So yeah, and I give them at the individual level, population level, community level. Feel free to go through these. I'm not going to go through these here in much detail because I think I'm already hitting, like, not hitting time in terms of like the span of like a normal lecture, but I think it's tougher to stay engaged for the entire span of a normal lecture on a YouTube video. So I'm going to try to actually keep my lectures sort of well under an hour, hopefully. And yeah, feel free to like sort of obviously pause and come back to things. I'll also try to add chapter sections or like YouTube like labels in the different spans to try to actually sort of allow you to like bounce around a little bit. Of course, I do encourage you to watch the entire lecture because you're going to get tested over this stuff. So yeah, at the individual level, we mess with hummingbird plant interactions. That's kind of cool. That's almost like a community level thing. But we mess with, the example that I give in the notes, I think, is some sort of changing song pattern or study of a single song pattern of an individual bird, because there's variation in individuals in a population. At the population level, I think this is something about bird mortality as a result of like outdoor cats. I think it's been a while since I looked at this actually, but I think that's what that is. It's showing like the drastic decrease in mortality as a function of like keeping cats indoors or something. And this would be at the population level, where you're considering some species of bird or some species of small mammal. And then community level, I have some example. This is probably different than the example here. Yeah, I'm saying like humans influence landscapes. Like if I just dig a big hole in the backyard, I'm going to disproportionately affect species in that community. If I have like a plant species that has very small numbers and it's like not that great at regrowing, and I damage it, I've damaged it to a much greater extent than a weedy species that is very abundant, because it's like, I don't really care if you killed off 2% of my population in this area, I'll recover. And so you can especially see this when you think about like urban adapted species. And so like bird species that are really, really good at actually exploiting urban environments. And so if you build like a city and a bunch of streets, it actually does better. Many bird species will do much worse. The ecosystem, I think this is a picture of a eutrophic lake. So I think at some point we talk about the process of eutrophication. It's basically sometimes human mediated, sometimes not, but it's most of the time I think it is. It's via inputs of nitrogen into a lake. Nitrogen causes phytoplankton and to grow and swell until they create a eutrophic, I was gonna say eutrophied, that's not a word. A eutrophic lake, where this is just many phytoplankton or blue-green alga. And then that can actually cause an anoxic environment. It can remove all the oxygen, anoxic, from the water, enough to cause like large fish kills. So all the fish in the lake just float to the top and die because there's not enough oxygen in the water. And then I skip biome and basically sort of shrug at it. But there are differences in how we affect biomes via our the disproportionate effect of global warming on different areas. And so toward the poles, I think global warming is sort of hitting harder. The rate of change, the rate of temperature change is greater toward the poles than it is in the tropics. Yeah, now it'd sort of be a biome level thing, typically. And then biosphere, it's just, I don't even know what I say or what the citation is to global livestock distribution. We are affecting the entire planet. It should sort of go without saying. Yeah, I'll try to pull in more sort of other examples as I go in my notes, but I'm definitely I think more in abstract concepts, and so a lot of times I'll, instead of giving you like a real world example, I'll just draw like a circle and a triangle and say, okay, these are two species. Let's start with that assumption, and now let's model these two species and try to understand how they interact and what comes out of it. I'll try to give more examples in the in-person class. So now we go into like how we study ecology. So we can study it at different scales. With all these scales, the population, individual population, community, up to biosphere. But how we actually do ecology is typically broken down into one of four ways, or some combination of one of these four ways. The first is direct observations. And so we go out and we, like Jane Goodall, pictured here in this photo. So she was a primatologist and I guess behavioral ecologist, consider her, that went out and studied the social interactions and the behavior of great apes, and just sort of took observations. It can be as simple as going out. So there's like a long-term study in Panama looking at tree growth. And so every tree is tagged and they go out and they observe the height of the tree. You go out and you say, even if you were to capture animals and not just like sort of take notes, but let's say I like set up a bunch of these little traps and I live trap small mammals in a given area. That is still observational in its process. You're just observing what species are there and trying to have sort of as little impact as possible. And the thing is like you're not trying to actually implement any sort of change to the system. So you go out and you're trying to like assess what the community of small mammals is. You're not trying to assess what's the role of predator removal on the small mammal community. If you wanted to do that, this would be through the second sort of mode or how we typically do ecology. And that's the field experiments. And so let's say in that example where I want to see the effect of predator removal or exclusion on the small mammal community, I would have one here, this like control plot where I allow things to sort of go as usual. And then this other one where I'd actually try to actively exclude the predators. And so I'd build nets. I'd do something to change the system and then observe the outcome. And so there I've called that a field experiment. Observation are typically also sort of under the guise of field experiments, but I needed some way to separate those two. These are sometimes called manipulative field experiments, and these would just be like field experiment or observational experiment. Another form of experiment is sort of a laboratory experiment. So this is when you would bring so let's say like this level has too many exogenous variables, there's too much going on. You want to control everything. I want to be able to control temperature and the temporal nature of temperature. I want to have like a spike here and then a drop here. And nature just can't do that for me. Then I would bring things into the lab and have laboratory experiments. And so here, the example that I'm giving are, I think this is an experiment that I ran while at University of California, in which we took flower beetles, which are very small little beetles of two different species, and combined them in different initial abundance combinations to see if we could sort of observe competitive indeterminacy, which is the idea of if you start species at different abundances, there's some initial combination of abundances that leads to, you don't know the outcome, right? We'll go into competition theory a bit. And so remember this maybe, I don't know, but it was a cool study. And we also controlled dispersal. So this may not be the study I'm thinking of. This may be a different study. But you could not do this in a field system. It's just impossible. You're making manipulations that are not possible in a field system. And then the last one that I sort of have an example of are ecological models. And so I think how I arranged it in this way, we're seeing it as the most real to the system and the natural world. And then we start getting more abstracted into the realm of trying to explain generalizable processes. And so ecological models, and these things are paired, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily just create an ecological model. You'd want the ecological model to explain something about the natural world. And so you'd combine a field experiment or an observational experiment or a laboratory experiment with an ecological model. There's many different forms of ecological models. We'll start going into them as early as next week. I give an example here of the SIR model or the SI model. This is a model that tracks individuals as they go from susceptible to infected in discrete time. T+1 stands for the next time step. This B is a birth term. And then from that birth term, you subtract the transmission and infection of individuals in this class as a function of some transmission rate, beta, times the population of susceptibles times the population of infected individuals. And then you track infected individuals as they become infected, highlighting that beta SI term minus their recovery or death, which is gamma times IT. All right. And then in the notes, I go over a little bit about so in all of these experiments, in all these modes of scientific inquiry, it sort of starts with the idea of a hypothesis where I'm sure you've in previous science classes have like come up with a hypothesis and then tested it. And there's a huge difference between sort of biological hypotheses and statistical hypotheses, like the null hypothesis of like a t-test. If it's like a one sample t-test, it would be the mean of this distribution is different than some mu value that you set, typically like 0 or whatever. But biological hypotheses are quite different. However, there's a sort of a set of things that typically are indicative of a good hypothesis. And I list them here. And this is sort of based on, I guess, like Karl Popper's version of what makes a good hypothesis. So the hypothesis must be testable. You have to be able to actually like quantify and estimate the quantity that you're studying. They have to be general, so it can't typically be like just only in this one place, this is how things work, and nothing else, it just can't generalize to any other place. It's not ideal. It's not a good hypothesis. This is sort of Popper's big one, is that it has to be falsifiable. You have to actually have a test that would prove it to be untrue. And we can go over examples in class, but there's sort of like there's no such thing as a black swan or all swans are white hypothesis. And as you see a black swan, it's like, oh, okay, falsifiable. And then lastly, plausible. And so this shouldn't defy logic or what we know of a natural system. And this one's a little bit, yeah. It should be plausible, not in like just building on existing theory, but that, like, and not contradicting existing theory, because existing theory could potentially be wrong. It should just like not defy, clear logical bounds. All right, and so I think that I've covered everything that I wanted to cover in this sort of introductory lecture about what is ecology. I look forward to this semester and a series of lectures. We have like 130 students in the class for these two sections, which is brutal, but it should be fun. Yeah, and I hope many of you are enjoying online that are not at LSU. And I will stop sharing, and I will see you next time.